Good afternoon again. It's about 5 minutes after 2 o'clock p.m. on November 12, 2022. This is a message to the leadership of the nation of Honduras. So I want you to know, I have read the Constitution of the nation of Honduras, at least in English translation, but I've also read it in Spanish. I'm talking to those who represent themselves as the current leadership of Honduras. Last time I was in Honduras was in 2015. I'd gone to teach a bilingual school, private bilingual school. It's been over 7 years since I have been there. I left in August of 2015 because of certain circumstances. I'd been there more than 6 months, and by that time, somebody from the Ministry of Education should have come and done an interview with me in person, as I understand that was a requirement. No one did. Whether or not the obligations fulfilled with the Ministry of Education, in consideration of its mandated interviews with international teachers in the country, was fulfilled at that institution, I do not know. I do know since that time, I've attempted to contact the American consulate in Honduras. I went in person to the Honduran consulate in Chicago, and I've several times attempted to contact the Ministry of Education. I've received no response. It's been over 7 years. I consider myself abandoned. And insofar as my on-site presence in Honduras was connected to any mineral concession, the terms have not been honored. And hence, by virtue of your abandonment, you have no call. You have no lien. You have no right to anything about me or anything I did while I was there. My understanding is that the behavior of other teachers in the school was unsatisfactory. In the background, there are allegations connected to events that happened while I was there. Among them, a hack of the Saudi Foreign Ministry, as well as an announcement that came due later regarding the arrest of the current Speaker of the House at the time, the United States, Dennis Hastert, but also the death of the Attorney General of Delaware. You should have already been apprised of all of these facts and how they correlated. You should also have understood that by July of 2015, there was the end of a deadline that had been set up in connection with an executive order by President Barack Obama regarding the financial capabilities of young Americans. There was plenty of talk at the time about how Americanos were not just Norte Americanos, i.e., people from the United States. I contend the Ministry of Education was well apprised of these matters. And so the qualms that some people were having with the management of the databases, well, it was of material concern and should have been responded to appropriately, at least at some point in time in the intervening 7.5 years, but it has not been. For the record, I would never have agreed, and I never did agree, to allow for any of my students, including and especially minor students, including and especially students under the age of 13 years old, to be put into any accountancy system where they were allowed to be bid on as assets by people who might think that they were going to work with the Ministry of Education to determine young people that had promise and maybe borrow on their futures for current commerce. I was not aware at the time that operations involving Citigroup in Honduras as well as Nicaragua were in the course of acquisition by a Honduran bank that had conflicts of interest, at the very least, concerning their relationship with the Ministry of Education, as well as their relationship with the central bank. At some point in time, I did attempt to contact members of Congress in the United States about outstanding matters that were not directly related to my relationship with the education system in Honduras, but actually predated that and were very materially relevant in regards to matters pertaining to the United States. I say this because something happened. See, when I was in Honduras and I would do searches on the web for information, I found that what came up in Honduras was incredibly different than what came up in the United States. The reference points were different. Even if you did the same kinds of searches, including for the same references, the same sources, well, you just couldn't find them the same way in Honduras you could in the United States. I'm not very apprised of whatever the algorithm was of concern, but I've become more apprised of the fintech companies that were working with Honduran banks, including local banking institutions that were working with international banks, including ones in and headquartered in the United States. I'm very disappointed with the nation of Honduras' decision to begin a youth banks program through Citigroup, comparable to a youth banks program I understood was started around the time of the peace negotiations in Ireland that were overseen by the Clinton administration. At the time of this, I myself was in the cusp of going from what would be colegio to university. Nobody apprised me of the implications, including the long-term implications, and whether or not somebody had decided as a student I might be identified as somebody's assets for future acquisition. I contend it was actually your responsibility to give your students, starting with the teachers, appropriate information about what the financial obligations were, and to make sure they were constitutionally compliant. I contend they were not. Not only that, but the compensation arrangements were unacceptable. Not just the compensation arrangements for the teachers who were of Honduran descent or were born in Honduras versus international teachers, but also whatever the arrangements are with the so-called nonprofit sector, including in consideration of nonprofit organizations originating in the United States, and how that conflicts with the public education system there, including insofar as there's a long history in Honduras of the relationship between the education sector and the political and national movement. You all could say, perhaps it is not my place, somebody was foreign born, to meddle in the politics of another country, but I was entrusted with the future leadership of your country, and I contend you've done them a massive disservice. At no point in time would I ever have agreed to have allowed for you to ascetize any of my students to borrow on, including in the classroom. Your policy of permitting for students to take their cell phones to school so that their parents can contact them anytime they want is completely unacceptable. If you haven't changed it by now, well, then that says something about what your priorities were, regardless of your alleged regime change, how it was accomplished. When I was in Honduras, I had a communication with somebody back in the United States. Insofar as I now understand that operators in the Honduran government were monitoring my electronic communications, I understand that they would have been privy to this communication. It had to do with the appearance of the flag of another nation. And there were conflicting stories about the relationship that people in that country had with the people in Honduras, including and especially the understanding that they did not associate that flag with a national cause. They associated it with a specific religious tendency that was not in any way, shape, or form the predominant tendency of the people within that country. I'm very concerned that there has been a conspiracy involving people within the state of Texas, including people within the state of Texas that are part of the federal government of the United States and interest in Honduras, that have continued perpetuating a massively anti-Semitic scheme, including under the auspices that they're supporting Palestinians, when in fact they are not. There's nothing to support the Palestinian national cause or people of Palestine or Palestinian descent in what you've done. What it does instead is serve to further the interests of people that would exploit other people of faith, regardless of their faith tradition, in order to try to cowl them into subservience, into engaging in increasing acts of depravity in order to compromise their souls, up to and including making their children available for exploitation. You don't have a right to say it's a mineral concession. We should have already attended to these matters before now. I consider what the nation of Honduras allowed in the conspiracy with infiltrators at the Department of Treasury concerning not only the prosecution of the former head of state regarding the FIFA scam, but also in connection with people that were in various kinds of leadership, though it might be contested, both within the economic and the media sectors in Honduras, to be a stain, a specter. Not only has it disgraced Honduras, but it's disgraced the United States, specifically the Department of Justice. What happened with Rosenthal was a crime, not the kind of crime you wanted to promulgate. It was the start of another trend, and you know well what that trend is. You know well what that trend is because you know what had been seized in the United States sometime before, that you sought to get access to and convert to your own use in the most nefarious manner. And what it's done is it's engaged a conspiracy of delegitimizing actual women in leadership, including women from your own country. You should have been forthright about why people were leaving Honduras for the U.S.-Mexico border in the masses and numbers that they were. You should have been forthright about what you really meant by drug trafficking, especially before the evidence became available in the State Department's site in connection with its celebration of your Independence Day through the damn American embassies. You had no right to do what you did. It's very important that you be forthright about what your relationships are concerning your mineral concessions and the gas and oil sector of Mexico. What did you conspire to do? By now, some of those people have been there for 4 years. By your own law, 4 years is very important when it comes to considerations of export and demonstrated production. You're working on borrowed time. You're working on borrowed time you had no qualification for.
Excuse me. Could you lower your voice a little?
Yes, I will, as soon as I'm done.
Okay.
You're working on borrowed time you had no qualification for. Even if you were given an option when somebody else in your family was availed of the position you later sought for yourself, you had no right to try to follow through on my life, and you had no right to try to follow through in the lives of my students. How many of those people, how many of those families I used to work with, used to be among while I was in Honduras in 2015, are now on the U.S.-Mexico border? Any of them? Have any of them contracted COVID-19? How many more of them contracted chikungunya? How many of them were diagnosed with some sort of mental illness? You're going to have to let us know. I did not agree to let you use my students and financially exploit my students so that you could try to blackmail other people into cooperating with an anti-Semitic scheme I take very personally. See, before you tried to borrow my life for your political accomplishments, you should have confirmed whose life it was. You're not going to shame me into reconsidering myself in a form you find more complimentary. If you have a problem with the way I appear relative to your aspirations of appearances, you should have talked with me directly. I can be a very accommodating person if you're reasonable, but there's nothing reasonable about this. You need to cease and desist your sorcery. You need to cease and desist aiding and abetting people that are actually trying to resuscitate Nazism as a replacement for actual political leadership, including substantial political leadership you already had in your country. You should have exposed what really happened during the election of 2017. You shouldn't have cut the deal you did. I heard you. I heard you there, and I heard who you conspired with here. It's a cross-border conspiracy you're not going to get away with. I would advise you to reconsider your position immediately. I consider what you've done to be an act of war. I consider what you've done to be acts of war against the United States. I would have offered asylum to anybody that was rightly due it. But what I would not have offered was a chance to co-conspire with people in my country to turn the United States into a narco state so that you could legitimize a black market economy because you did not want to be responsible with how you divested actual political leadership in your own country for your own opportunism. You chose the wrong alliances. They will not prevail. I advise you to reconsider your position immediately.